Hey everyone, and welcome. My name's Aaron, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about EQ, or equalization. What is it? Where, how should I use it? Where should I not use it? And I want to give you some examples of sort of how I use it when I play guitar and when I mix and when I record and things like that. So the first thing we need to understand is all sound is vibration. And the speed of that vibration is called its frequency. It's how frequently it vibrates. So you may have heard that term frequency. It's actually just another word for pitch. Sounds that vibrate at a slower frequency are lower in pitch, and sounds that vibrate at a faster frequency are higher in pitch. And frequency is measured in cycles per second, or the number of times something vibrates in 1 second. Sometimes this is called Hertz or Hz. Hertz was a guy who discovered something. So anyway, you might see that when you see a frequency. You might see 60 Hz. That's 60 Hertz. That's 60 cycles per second. So the human hearing range is roughly 20 Hertz to 20 kilohertz, 20,000 Hertz. So you might hear kilohertz or you might hear K. If somebody says 5K, that means 5 kilohertz, 5,000 Hertz, 5,000 cycles per second. Incidentally, there are other mammals and animals who can hear a lot higher than human beings. Dogs, for one, you may have heard, because when you blow on the dog whistle, you can't hear it, but your dog comes running or freaks out or whatever it is. Dogs can hear up to 50K. Cats can hear up to like 80K. And dolphins can actually hear up to 150K. So human beings are actually pretty low on the evolutionary scale when it comes to hearing. But anyway, everything you've ever heard in your life is some combination of frequencies from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. Now, I say combination of frequencies because most natural sounds are a extremely complex combination of maybe a fundamental frequency and then a bunch of overtones and distortion and things like that. So just bear that in mind, that most sounds are a whole bunch of frequencies all mixed up. Also, the science is a little bit soft on this, but sounds that we can't hear, there's an argument that they can still sort of affect us. Like there's been evidence that low frequency sounds, like around 4 to 9K, can, if we hear it at a high decibel level, can actually make us sick. Some people think too that very, very high frequency sounds, well over 20K, we can perceive even though we're not really hearing them. And that's why actually a lot of modern recording equipment can record way higher than any human can hear. You can decide for yourself on that, if you use the gear and you think you can hear a difference or whatever. But in general, we're going to stick with 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz as the human hearing range. So what is EQ? EQ, or equalization, is the manipulation of frequencies in a given recorded signal to achieve a desired result. Typically, to enhance good-sounding frequencies and to minimize bad-sounding frequencies. There are two main types of EQ, two main ways that we do this. One is graphic EQ. This is basically a set of frequencies, each with its own level control. The simplest example of this is maybe like your car stereo. It's got bass, mid, and treble, if you're lucky. So low, mid, and high. I've just got bass and treble in mind, low and high. What frequency is the low? Who knows? What frequency is the high? I don't know. But that's all you have, and you can either turn it up or down. Simple, easy. You see this in a lot of home stereo setups and consumer type of equipment and some simpler plugins. Also, a lot of times with these things, you end up seeing this smiley face EQ. If you've ever heard that term, this is where it comes from a graphic EQ, and someone's just put like a smiley face in it. One main reason people do that is because our ears are very, very sensitive to mid-range. It's because the shape of our ear canal is actually the size of a 1 kilohertz tone. 1 kilohertz is right in the middle of the mid-range of the frequency spectrum when it comes to human hearing. And so we hear those sounds much more quickly than other sounds, than very low sounds or very high sounds. We hear that mid-range and we hear it immediately and we think it's harsh sounding or whatever. And so a lot of times we will scoop out that mid-range and accentuate the high end and the low end to sort of make it more pleasing so we can turn it up really loud and not have it hurt our ears. The other type of EQ is called a parametric EQ. A parametric EQ is a variable multi-band EQ that allows you to adjust frequency, boost and cut, and bandwidth. Now, what am I talking about? So a parametric EQ starts out as more of a blank slate. Instead of being given a certain set of frequency bands that I can either turn up or turn down, I can first choose what frequency. I can slide that frequency around. I can pinpoint it. So I can choose exactly what frequency I want, and then I can boost or cut that frequency. Not only that, but I can change the bandwidth. That is, I can change how the frequencies around that fundamental frequency react when I boost or cut that frequency. This bandwidth is sometimes called the curve or the Q. If you've ever seen a Q like control on a plugin, a very high Q is a very narrow bandwidth. So if I select like 4K and I want to turn it up and I want to have a very narrow Q, if I have a higher number Q, I'll be boosting only 4K and nothing else around it. In contrast, if I have a very low Q, this is a low number, that's a very wide frequency band that I'm boosting. So when I boost 4K, I'm not only boosting 4K, but I'm boosting 3K and 2K and 1K and 500 hertz and all kinds of things. So as you might imagine, low Q or very wide curve adjustments on a parametric EQ are much more dramatic sounding, because if I'm going to boost 4K and also all these other frequencies around it, a whole bunch of that kind of mid to top end is going to get boosted in the signal. This is useful when you want to make an overall instrument or sound source just brighter overall. I want to bring up a bunch of frequencies around that fundamental frequency. A lot of times EQ boosts with low Qs or very wide curves can sound a little bit more natural than if you get in there really surgically with a narrow Q. So narrow curves or narrow Qs can be really useful actually when you're going in there and you want to cut something that's really annoying sounding to you. So let's say maybe you're ringing out a vocal microphone, someone's got a headset mic and there's a feedback at a certain frequency. You want to get in there and pinpoint just that frequency and only cut that and leave everything else alone. Or maybe it's like something on a snare drum, there's like a ring on a snare drum, and you don't really want to cut everything around it, but you just want to cut that one little annoying frequency. That's a great candidate for a very narrow Q. And a lot of times actually what I'll do is to find the offending frequency, I'll boost it up with a very narrow Q and sweep the frequency spectrum until I can find the most annoying. It's like, it's like, there it is. Okay, turn that one down. A couple more little terms that are useful to know. Shelf. This is an EQ that boosts or cuts a frequency and everything above it or everything below it. So if I'm going to do a low shelf boost at 80 hertz, that's going to boost 80 hertz and everything below 80 hertz. And everything below 80 hertz. Or if I'm going to do a high shelf at 8K or 8 kilohertz, that will boost 8K and everything above 8K. A bell, essentially a parametric EQ is a bell. If you ever see an EQ on a graph, and it's shaped like a bell, that's a bell curve. Sometimes in a plugin you can choose if you want bell or shelf. That's what that's talking about. A low pass, now these get a little confusing and they don't make a ton of logical sense, but a low pass is actually a high cut. So if I put my low pass at 4K, it's actually cutting everything above 4K. So it's letting the low pass through and it's cutting the high. Same thing with a high pass. It's letting the highs pass through and cutting the low. So if I have a high pass filter at 60 hertz, it's basically cutting everything below 60 hertz. And a filter, if you ever hear the term filter, that's typically one or two bands. If you're talking about a filter plugin, a lot of times it's just one band and it's very specific and you want to get in there and be surgical, or sometimes with mastering, guys will use filters or whatever. Sometimes a filter can be talking about a high pass filter or a low pass filter. Most of the time, that's what those terms mean. So some examples. As a disclaimer, there's no substitute for just getting in there and tinkering with stuff yourself and learning how you respond to different frequencies and which ones you like and which ones you don't like. But I want to give you some general guidelines to places that I go, my little go-to spots for problem frequencies and good frequencies that I like and things like that. So first, drums. Drums are an extremely wide frequency band. You have everything from the lowest of the low kick drum to the highest of the high twinkly angelic cymbals. Kick drum specifically, the like thump of a kick drum that hits you in your chest, somewhere around 60 to 80 hertz. A lot of times I will end up boosting that. If you stand next to a typical kick drum, there's actually not a ton of low end in there. And the sound of modern recorded music, most of that sound has been added and accentuated after the fact. And we love it now. We love that low kick you in the chest get your heart beating and get you dancing or whatever. We've just grown accustomed to it and we love it. 60 to 80 hertz. In general, that's a great spot to boost on a kick drum. 300 hertz, I almost always cut on a kick drum. That's like mud. It sounds muddy. Cut 300 hertz. In a lot of different instruments, specifically kick drum. Cut 300 hertz, you'll be happy. And then the nice click of the attack of the beater on the kick drum is maybe like 4 to 5K. Boost 4K on a kick drum. Toms are somewhat similar, a little bit different. The low end that I like to boost on a tom is more around 100 hertz to 150 hertz. And then I'll cut around 300 to 400 hertz in there, depending on what tom somebody's hitting, what size it is, and things like that. And then I'll boost a little bit higher, like 7 to 8K, I'll boost on toms. Snare drums, it really depends on what kind of snare you have, but I like a big fat sounding snare, kick you in the chest sort of snare. That thump of the snare drum is anywhere from around 150 hertz to 220 hertz or so. And again, it really depends on the drum. Having said that, there's also a lot of problems that can develop anywhere from 200 hertz to 500 hertz. A lot of times when you hit a snare drum, you get that ring. Depending on where the ring is, that's kind of that problem area, 200 to 500 hertz or so. So a lot of times I'll get in there with a little surgical narrow band EQ and cut out some of that ring. And then the crack at the top of the snare, that definition is maybe around 5K. I like boosting like a high shelf around 5K. So try 5K on the snare drum. Cymbals, it really depends on what cymbals you use. I love to record very dark cymbals. Cymbals are so bright anyway. I like to record nice, dark, beautiful, complex sounding cymbals. And that's, a lot of people have actually said that they love the sound. How do you get the cymbals to sound like that? A lot of it is just that the cymbals that I record, they just sound like that. And if you were in a room with them, you'd go, oh, that's how you got them to sound like that, because that's just how they sound. So that's part of it. But also, I tend to use darker microphones. I love using ribbon mics actually as overheads, which are dark sounding mics. When I do EQ overheads or cymbals specifically, sometimes you'll want to cut out some of that harshness around 3 to 4K. That's kind of that ear piercing thing, it's that upper mid-range. And then you can boost a little bit at maybe 10K and above sometimes on overheads. Bass guitar goes lower than drums, really, in my experience, in my opinion. And a lot of times I'll boost maybe around 80 hertz, but really I like the bass to sit kind of below, just below the kick drum in as far as frequency. I'll also cut that 300 hertz on bass. Do you notice a pattern here? 300 hertz is good for almost nothing. It's just muddy. When we hear 300 hertz, it's not really like low end. It's not really like mid range. It's kind of right in that no man's land of like, something doesn't sound right. What is it? It's 300 hertz. Turn down 300 hertz. Almost everywhere you go, just turn it down. Aside from that, bass guitar, sometimes I don't do any EQ on it. It really, really depends on how you record it. And bass is a very important thing to get right when you're recording it. My favorite bass sounds that I've ever mixed are the ones that I haven't had to do hardly anything to. They just sound how they sound. And so I've learned to really be picky when I record bass about what bass is being recorded, what gear is it going through, what preamp, who's playing it, things like that. But when I do EQ it, I'll tend to take 300 hertz out. Sometimes I'll boost a little mid-range to get a little clarity around maybe 800 hertz or so. 600 to 800 hertz boost on the bass. Boost a little 80 hertz to give you that nice warm, super low, sub-low end. Acoustic guitars. I actually like to do like a high shelf. This is crazy, but I like to do a high shelf starting at about 1.5K. That's a hugely generous high shelf. I mean, basically I'm starting in the mid-range and turning everything up above it. After I boost that, I'll put a compressor to kind of tame some of that top end. What that does, I find, is it allows the tone, the music of the guitar to come through, because the majority of the tone is right in that mid-range. And by boosting that EQ and then compressing it, you're really bringing out kind of that tone, that music, the heart of the acoustic guitar. A lot of times when you hear acoustic in recorded music or when you hear it live, all you can really hear is the strings. It's like I don't hear any tone, I don't hear any music, I don't hear beautiful things coming out of that, all I hear is strings. So it might seem counterintuitive to do a high shelf starting at 1.5K, but just try it. Try it. It actually works. It's crazy. Also on acoustic guitar, anything below about 200 hertz I just cut and get rid of, unless it's like acoustic guitar and vocal and that's the only thing in the mix. When you're doing a pop mix, get rid of the low end in acoustic guitar. Get rid of the low end in a lot of instruments, as a matter of fact. Electric guitars, I love to boost around 3 to 4K. Be generous with a nice high shelf boost around 3 to 4K, and then adjust kind of the level. A lot of times, electric guitars need to be brighter than you think they need to be heard and picked out in modern music. A lot of times I'll cut lots of low end too in electric guitars. Let the bass and drums kind of take that area and give kind of that mid-range to electric guitars. With all instruments, you're carving out little spaces for them to exist. There's always going to be some overlap, but once instruments start overlapping too much, people can't pick them out and they start complaining and they start saying things like it's muddy or it's not clear, I don't understand it, and they walk away or they turn it off. What you want is to carve out a nice little area for each one of your instruments. Here's my bass guitar area. Here's the space it's occupying. Here's my kick drum area. Here's my snare drum area. Here's my vocal area. Here's my electric guitars area. Also, on electric guitars, I like to actually boost 300 hertz. It's one of the only places, probably the only place that I will actually boost 300 hertz. That's kind of the low end on an electric guitar. It doesn't really go much lower than about 300 hertz. And that's kind of the sweet spot for boosting that. I've been cutting it everywhere else, so I have space there to boost a little bit on electric guitars, and that'll give you a nice big low end and make your electric guitar sound huge. Piano is all about the magical mid-range. It's a beautiful mid-range instrument. Piano is my first instrument and I love it. And there are so many bad piano sounds out there, so many bad piano samples. And what they almost always get wrong is the mid-range. When you sit down at a real piano and you play it, it's got this lovely, comprehensive, beautiful mid-range sound. And my favorite piano samples are the ones that get the mid-range right. A lot of times in recorded music, people are like, I can't hear the piano, so they turn up the top end, like they turn up like 6K and above or whatever. And it just sounds horribly harsh because piano is such a percussive instrument. I don't want to really hear the attack so much as I want to hear the note, the heart of the sound, which lives in the mid-range. So a lot of times I'll boost about 1K. I'll find a nice, generous, big, wide, low Q, and I'll kind of boost overall mids on a piano. I'll cut maybe the top and actually the bottom. And vocals really, really, really depends on who you're talking about that you're recording here. It's very hard to make generalizations when it comes to vocals. But in general, the heart of the sound of a vocal is in the mid-range. Again, our ears are evolved to pick out human voices because our ears are shaped like a 1 kilohertz tone. And so we're very sensitive to it and we like hearing it, but it can be too much very quickly. A lot of times massaging an EQ on a vocal is kind of about taming and given that mid-range, sort of the TLC. My own voice, specifically, is a little bit accentuated right around 2K. And so a lot of times I will cut 2K like I am right now on this recording. I'm going through my Vintech X73i preamp over there, and I'm cutting 2K because I just know that it's easier to listen to me if you cut 2K. I'm gonna go over there and actually turn it up and you'll hear the difference. Okay, so now we have 2K turned up, and you can hear it's even more harsh on my voice, and you can probably hear why I like to turn it down. Let's go turn that back down. Yes, much better. So 2K, I just know that about my own voice, that I don't love 2K. When I'm going somewhere to sing and maybe it's a new PA or whatever, I'll just go over to the EQ and just pre-EQ the thing, take 2K out. It's about experimentation and figuring out what works for you. And again, with voice, it's all about learning what that specific person's voice sounds like and what you want to cut and what you want to boost and all kinds of things. So now I want to take you through a couple of my favorite EQ plugins and pieces of hardware. First of all, the Vintech X73i. It's basically a Neve 1073 type preamp EQ. I absolutely love these things. I like to use about 10 of them or so when I'm recording drums. I'll use EQ generously while recording just because this EQ is so musical sounding. And what I mean when I say that is it doesn't sound like you're using an EQ. It just sounds like, oh, that's what the source sounds like now. It just sounds brighter now, but it doesn't sound unnatural. It doesn't sound phasey and weird and clinical or whatever. So I love that thing. I use it a lot on the way in. And then as far as plugins, I love the Waves SSL channel and the Waves SSL EQ. This is a great bundle of plugins. If you want to go buy it, I highly recommend it. It just works. I reach for knobs. I can be very aggressive with EQ and it still sounds good. Again, it doesn't sound weird. Before I had this EQ, I never wanted to use plugin EQs because it always just kind of sounded worse when I started using them. After I got this is just the de facto standard, my go-to. When I need EQ on something, that's what I put on it. 95% of the time, that's what I'm using. I also like the Waves EQ P1, which is like a Pultec style EQ. I find with this thing, you can be even more aggressive. You can boost a heck of a lot or cut a heck of a lot, and it's not a super dramatic difference. It's a very smooth, natural, beautiful sounding EQ that's kind of emulates the hardware Pultecs that cost lots of money. And really, that's about it. There's not much more than that I use. And there are others that are out there that are great and do a great job. I know a lot of people love Fab Filter and a few others, but the point is you don't have to have a ton of different EQ plugins to get great results. I basically use one, and that's just what I use, and it sounds good, and that's really all I need. So lastly, I just want to say EQ is important to understand, but don't necessarily reach for one right away. If you don't like the sound you're hearing, there are other things you should do before you do EQ, like switch out the instrument you're playing, or maybe switch the person who's playing the instrument. Switch out the microphone, switch out the placement of the microphone. All of these things will affect the sound, and you have to keep all of that in mind. EQ is very useful, but it's one of many tools in an audio engineer's little toolbox. Cool. Well, I hope that was helpful. Feel free to leave any comments or questions you have below. We'll see you guys next time.